You know that moment when someone says, he'll grow out of it, but what you're actually watching doesn't feel like growth at all. It feels like emotional avoidance dressed up as personality. He can talk to people easily. He can joke in almost any situation. He can handle work, friendships, and casual conversations without much effort. On the surface, nothing looks wrong. In fact, he may even seem more relaxed than most people around him. But the moment the conversation becomes emotional, something shifts. He redirects it. He lightens the mood. He jokes at the exact point where something real was starting to form, and you're left with that quiet feeling that something important just got avoided without being acknowledged. For a long time, people label this as immaturity, or say he is just not serious enough yet. Sometimes it gets excused as personality, or he doesn't like drama. But psychology has been quietly observing a deeper pattern underneath this behavior. It often starts earlier than relationships themselves. It starts in how a person learns to handle emotional discomfort. Not extreme emotions, but the subtle ones. The uncomfortable moments that come with vulnerability, accountability, or emotional depth. And for some people, those moments were never learned as something to stay with. They were learned as something to escape from. So instead of sitting with emotional tension, they develop ways to exit it. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's humor that arrives too quickly. Sometimes it's silence that cuts the conversation short. Sometimes it's changing the subject so smoothly that the emotional thread disappears without conflict. And sometimes it's agreement without presence, where the words sound right but the emotional engagement is missing. From the outside, none of this looks extreme. It can even look like calmness or emotional ease. But underneath, something consistent is happening. Emotional development is not just about understanding feelings. It's about learning to stay present when feelings become uncomfortable. Especially in relationships where emotions are not always convenient or tidy. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Some people were never fully trained to remain in that space. So when emotional weight enters a conversation, they don't lean in, they lean away. Not physically, but emotionally. They stay in the room, but not fully in the conversation. And the strange part is that this doesn't feel like avoidance to the person doing it. It feels like control. It feels like keeping things calm. It feels like avoiding unnecessary tension. But on the receiving end, it feels very different. Emotional responsibility slowly becomes uneven. One person starts holding the deeper conversations, the clarifications, the emotional reflection, and often the repair after misunderstandings, while the other remains in a lighter emotional space. Here is where it becomes noticeable over time. This rarely happens in one dramatic moment. There is no single argument that reveals everything. Instead, it builds through repetition. You begin to notice you're the one bringing up important conversations. You're the one giving emotional clarity. You're the one returning to unresolved issues. And slowly, without anyone naming it, emotional effort becomes uneven in a way that starts to feel normal, even when it isn't. And something subtle begins to happen to you. You start adjusting yourself. You soften your emotions before expressing them. You choose your timing more carefully. You explain your feelings in more detail just to avoid being misunderstood or dismissed. You become more emotionally aware, not because it is natural to you, but because the situation quietly requires it. Meanwhile, the other person still seems fine, still relaxed, still unbothered. But that unbothered feeling often comes from distance rather than balance. Because when someone consistently avoids emotional depth, they don't carry the same emotional weight of the situation. The intensity doesn't fully land for them because they're not engaging with it in the same way. So while you're processing and reflecting, they may experience the situation as lighter than it actually is for you. And this is where confusion begins. From the outside, nothing looks clearly wrong. There is no obvious neglect, no dramatic breakdown, just a slow emotional fatigue that is difficult to explain. And when people feel that, they often turn inward first. They question themselves before they question the dynamic. Am I too sensitive? Am I expecting too much? Is this just how relationships are supposed to feel? But psychology suggests something important here. Human beings are highly sensitive to emotional consistency, not perfection, but consistency. When emotional responsibility is uneven over time, your mind registers it long before you can explain it logically. It doesn't appear as one big issue. It appears as a pattern of small emotional gaps that slowly accumulate. And in response, you adapt. You become more self-contained. You start handling more emotional weight alone. You may stop bringing certain things up because it feels easier than the likely outcome. And slowly, you become the one maintaining emotional stability in the relationship without ever being asked to take on that role. What makes this more complex is that this pattern is often not intentional. In many cases, it comes from emotional conditioning. Growing up in environments where emotions were dismissed or not properly handled can teach someone to reduce emotional intensity rather than engage with it. So in adulthood, when emotions rise, their instinct is to lighten them, avoid them, or redirect them. But relationships don't grow through emotional lightness alone. They require presence, especially in uncomfortable moments. And when that presence is missing in one direction, a gap forms between two emotional experiences. One person is engaging with depth, the other is staying at a safer emotional distance. If this is starting to sound familiar, it's not about labeling anyone as broken or wrong. It's about recognizing that emotional styles differ. Some people are naturally more comfortable with emotional depth, others are more comfortable with emotional distance. And when those two styles meet, the mismatch does not always appear immediately. It appears slowly, through patterns of emotional effort. And once you begin to see it clearly, something changes. You stop automatically blaming yourself for feeling drained. You stop assuming that needing emotional reciprocity is too much. You start recognizing that emotional effort is supposed to be shared, not silently carried by one person over time. And if these ideas resonate with you, you might enjoy exploring more psychology like this. Subscribing helps this channel reach people who may need to hear it. And what is often missed is how slowly this realization forms. Nobody notices it in the beginning. It builds quietly through small moments of discomfort, repeated emotional imbalance, and gradual adaptation, until one day you finally see the pattern clearly, not because it changed suddenly, but because you finally had enough perspective to recognize what was already there. And that moment of clarity can feel heavy at first, but it also brings understanding. And understanding changes how you relate to your experiences, not by forcing action, but by allowing you to see things as they are, rather than how you hoped they would be. And sometimes that's where real awareness begins.